Good morning. It's Bill Howatt with COVID-19 mental health. I'm here again to have a conversation with you. Today, I'm going to start to move into the conversation around isolation. You're going to start to see all kinds of people talking about isolation and what that means. And I want to start taking, again, from a mental health perspective, being mindful this is not to be counseling or therapy. It's Bill still alone in his apartment on Friday. So, we're all doing the best we can. And one of the things I want to do is start talking about mental health. For me, if I asked you what the algorithm is for mental health, you may draw a pause. But for me, when I do teaching and talking on this, the algorithm for mental health is physical health, mental fitness, and social connections. I'll talk about the others on another chat. Now I want to start talking about the concept around social connections. Social connections are vital for our mental health. It's one of the core pillars for us. So this concept around isolation, and we start hearing about it more, the reality we're hearing about it more because what we're starting to hear more about is this thing called social isolation, or actually asking people to self-isolate, and meaning, as I talked about yesterday, is to create that physical barrier, but we still want you highly connected. But I want to spend a little bit of time to talk about what that means. There's really, in my research, when I think about this concept around isolation, there's two types. There's one is objective isolation. My father, I lost a couple of years ago, who was my mentor and one of the most important people in my life. At his end of his life, he was in his bed. And he was in his bed and he couldn't move. And he was objectively isolated in his bed, meaning there was no question he was stuck in his bed. He couldn't get up, he couldn't feed himself, he couldn't go to the bathroom himself, he couldn't do anything. He was completely dependent on everybody. However, if you ask my father if he ever felt alone, he will tell you no. My mother was with him every day. We visited him all the time. And the nurses were, and the caretakers were absolutely incredible human beings. And they, again, we have to be mindful. Our healthcare workers right now, we need to do all we can to be supportive of them and pay attention to their needs and make sure that we're, you know, being really, really appreciative, because by them going to do their job and us do our job by staying home and taking care of ourselves, we're making their job easier. Now, moving on to the next construct is what's called perceived isolation. Now, perceived isolation is something I spend some time. I mentioned yesterday in the Globe and Mail, I have a survey. I'm doing a series in the Globe and Mail. And it's all around perceived isolation. And this was all pre-pandemic, so whether I can't actually take any credit for predicting or doing anything. It's just serendipitous how this happened. But my belief has been for a long time, my just cause this year was to talk about social connections. And one of the things around social connections, around perceived isolation, what's really important for you to think about when you're having this conversation with yourself is that there's different things that can create barriers for us. Like, for example, financial stress, my commute, my job satisfaction, my relationship that I'm in, my parenting, elder care that if I've taken on, all these things can mount where they create perceived barriers that keep us from doing things we may want to do or perceive to have the time and energy to connect and reach out. And when somebody gets caught, and perceived barriers are seldom unidimensional and typically multidimensional, so you have more than one. And that's one of the reasons why I'm encouraging people to do a survey on this, to start to get their mind around what does perceived barriers look like. Now, the new perceived barrier that we're all talking about is this self-isolation. Now, what's important about a perceived barrier, it's our perception. And our brain, what we perceive, when we start to put things in there, it can become very, very strong and very powerful. And what I'd like you to consider when you think about this is the frequency, duration, and intensity. Is we have a perceived barrier and we don't take action to remit those, that can start to impact our mental health, which can actually lead to a concept called loneliness. Those powerful, powerful emotions that we have where we feel isolated. Now, the challenge is when you start to feel lonely and you start getting caught in that emotional part of our brain, that can start to retract us. And if we could kind of in this feedback loop where the perceived isolation starts to become problematic because we feel it's a big barrier, our emotions become problematic and they start to feed it. What I'd like you to think about is this. there's an interaction between our perceived isolation and our loneliness, our emotion. So my coaching for you is a couple things. Is now first become aware. Awareness is the number one thing. Become aware that there's a thing called perceived isolation. We still can go outside and go for a walk, for example. We can still wave at people. We can still call people. We can still text people. We can still write letters to people. We can still FaceTime with people. We can still do this I'm doing with you using a web video cast. There are things that we can do that can help us feel connected, that we can help remit that perceived barrier. So, what I'd like you to consider is it's awareness, number one. Two is accountability, is getting a routine, getting some structure, getting up in the morning, showering the same time, moving, creating a routine, creating a list. And that's why we created a blog at the Conference Board of Canada called Insulating Isolation. So take a read. It'll give you some coaching tips that will help you. And the other thing that's really important for me to end on this is action. And as we start to take action in regards to what we're going to do to promote our mental health to help us. So this may be a right time if you're struggling and having a hard time. There is to start to build your own personal mental fitness plan that can help build your resiliency. And I'm going to spend some time talking about resiliency and coping skills and different things to help. But today, what I want you to see is a relationship between perceived isolation. The higher you think you have a load, the greater you're going to perhaps feel that you're lonely. And if you are aware of what's going on, that's half the battle with mental health. Again, I'm going to tell you is that one of the big things I can tell you for myself as a person who lives with a mental health issue, as I mentioned yesterday, is awareness and self-empowerment and being aware that we do have some decisions, but we need to first have the insight. That's one of the biggest barriers for people to actually feel there is in somewhat control, is to become aware. So with that, I'm going to wish you a peaceful Friday, and hopefully that you're starting to realize that we're most of us that have been going through this 1 week, things are going to continue to evolve. And as we get through, we'll be here as long as it takes, and we're going to do this one day at a time, and we'll all get through this one day at a time. And what's going to happen is and you need to know this, I'm going to close on this, the concept of insulation, where it'll become more and more problematic as we go along if you're not preparing. It's like training for a marathon. Right now is the time to start to focus on your mental fitness and start to really take this stuff to heart, because it will help you. So it means you can help your family. So I wish you the best. Take care.